Hurrem Sultan Roxolana is undoubtedly the most famous Ukrainian woman in the world. Although, if another Ukrainian woman, Anna Yaroslavna, the Queen of France, had a serious myth about her, she would be a strong competitor to the Ottoman chief consort. After all, there are many myths and legends about her life that Roxolana can only dream of. Think yourself, a girl from Rus, who came to Paris from far eastern Kiev, taught the French to wash, kings to read, preserved the Orthodox faith and left the Cyrillic Gospel on which the following kings swore. Before that, a powerful melodramatic plot, the quick passing of the old king, the regency over her young son, the second marriage with the promiscuous Raoul de Crépy, his excommunication from the church, letters from the Pope with enthusiastic regards, the return to her homeland and the grateful remembrance of her descendants, which allowed to prevent the destruction of St. Sophia Cathedral by the communists. Isn't it on par with the Turkish The Magnificent Century? Greetings, I'm Kapranov brother, so it's time to figure out our past, to build our future together. History is the legacy of our ancestors, and we have to pass it along to our future generations, so they know what Ukrainians do on this land, where they, as in we, came from and where we are headed. That's why, 1,000 years later, the history of Rus is so important to us. So, how do we know about the existence of Anna Yaroslavna? The answer will surprise you, exclusively from French chronicles. Rus annals are void of her mentions. Traces of this youngest daughter of Prince Yaroslav are not found in domestic documentation, although that's not entirely true. On the wall of St. Sophia Cathedral, just in place where the prince's family stood during a church service, the scientists discovered the inscription Anna, at a height about 1.5 meters above the floor. Anna, then this name was spelled with one N. The height of inscription suggests that it was left by a child. Well, that's not very convincing. Anybody could have scratched that onto the wall. However, there are such signatures on a later French document. Look at this. In very recognizable handwriting, Anna Rina, that is Rina, the queen, Queen Anna. But on the wall is just Anna. The handwriting suggests that both were left by the same person. See, that's much better. Let's keep going. So, sometime during the 30s or 40s of the 11th century, a little girl Anya stood next to her father Yaroslav, baptized George, and mother Ingegerd, baptized Irene, and carved her name into the wall. And then father got angry, and as a punishment, married her off to the first king he could find. Or maybe it was the other way around. The girl heard from the father that she was going to the wild and far west, and during a service of worship she carved her name to leave a mark. Just as school graduates spray Class of 2020 on the walls, or as DMOPs spray DMB 1998. One way or another, father helped his daughter to pack for the road, put the gospel written in Cyrillic in her trunk, and sent her to the other end of the continent. Also, regarding putting the gospel, no cap. That's like a modern-day parents giving you a tablet for the road. As for the fact that the French king swore on it, that's sus. After all, the famous Reims Gospel associated with Yaroslavna was presented to Reims Cathedral by Duke Charles V of Lorraine only in 16th century. And before that, as scholars assume, it was kept in Czechia, where the Cyrillic part, which indeed was created during the reign of Yaroslav, and the Croatian part, written in Glagolitic script, were sewn together. All in all, quite a bizarre amalgamation. Of course, a whole story can be made up explaining how Anna's book got from Paris to Czechia, was upgraded, and was moved to Constantinople, where it was bought by a Catholic cardinal. But there is no scientific data about this unbelievable adventure. By the way, there is no evidence that King swore on the Reims Gospel either, although this could very well have happened. Few of the monarchs ever opened the book on which they swear. And if you can't even read, then distinguishing Cyrillic from Latin is tough. Well, since we already dove into making assumptions, makes sense to assume that daughter Anna or Anna asked Father Yaroslav, "Dad, for what? What did I do wrong? You married elder sister Yelizaveta to the Norwegian King Harald. The other sister, Anastasia, was married to the Hungarian King Andrew. Both of them are respected rulers, and the countries are very near too. And you are sending me to some shithole of a place for an old childless widower who only rules Paris and a village or two? Why, Dad? Just because I'm the youngest?" Hold up, did you just say that Paris is a shithole? The capital of France? Paris wasn't even the capital of France yet. The city and its suburbs were constantly tormented by the Normans. It's cause Anna Fiancé's grandpa owned property there, and when he got his hands on the throne of France, he announced Paris his own capital and started to rebuild it. Now compare this with Rus's grandeur and radiant Kyiv. So now Anna's complaints suddenly ring true. By the way, Anna being the youngest is also not definitive. There's still no rational explanation to this marriage. Henry I Capet, that's his surname, was indeed in the 40s at the time of the marriage, had constant wars with vassals who had no respect for his power, and on top of that, his first wife died in labor. Unfortunately, the child did not survive either. That's not a great option for the daughter of the Grand Prince of Kiev, whose lands stretch from the Baltic to the Black Sea, not from the Seine to the Loire. However, from the point of view of genetics, that choice was the most successful, because, thanks to this, the blood of Grand Prince Yaroslav of Kiev still flows in the veins of many royal, ducal and earl modern-day celebrities. Because selection is a tricky thing. It's not the one who has more money or power who wins, but the one who left more descendants. What a wise guy this Yaroslav fella was, huh? The road to France isn't short even today, but back then it took riding oxen, crossing mountain passes, the steppe through rivers and forest paths for months. And also, on Yaroslavna's supposed way to Paris, the Kiev authorities recently started putting up small monuments to a girl in a crown, to remind the arrogant Europe of her Ukrainian heritage. The sculptures are already standing in Kiev, Krakow and Arlon in Belgium. To be continued. After arriving in Paris, Anna was very surprised by the French customs, starting with the fact that her husband Henry was illiterate, and ending with the absence of a bathhouse in the palace and general disregard for washing. She even wrote to Father Yaroslav, "To what a barbaric country you sent me. Here the houses are gloomy, the churches are ugly, and the morals are terrible." Poor girl, how could the father's heart withstand such horror? However, despite the fact that bathing was actually disliked in medieval Europe, this letter is nothing more than a 19th century fake. It is especially funny to read this text, which is circulating on the Russian internet. "Hello, my most beloved Papa. Your faithful daughter Anichka, Anna Yaroslavna Rurikovich. Now the French Queen is writing to you, Grand Prince of all Rus." Anna Yaroslavna Rurikovich. For real? It's like signing a passport form. And this, "my most beloved Papa. In Kiev, Papa." An anecdote comes to mind about a Galician man who sent his son to the city to study, and he arrives home and says, "Hello, Papa." There are different opinions about whether Henry was literate. We couldn't find a sample of his signature, but we also didn't find a cross in its place. This question probably needs delving into French historical annals. Although it should be noted that illiterate nobles in those days were more than common. So, the French king Henry I Capet and the Rus princess Anna got married in the year 1051 in the Reims Cathedral, hence likely the myth about the Reims Gospel. And within a year, the Kiev immigrant gave birth to the king's son, whom she named Philip. Why did I say she named Philip? Usually the monarchs choose names for their son. It's because the Ukrainian name Philip did not exist in France at the time. Anna's son is the first Philip to be precise, on the French throne. In fact, Philippos, that is one who loves horses, is a Greek name popular in our lands and completely unknown in France at the time. So all the future kings, dukes and commoners named Philip is the merit of our Anna. In addition to Philip, Anna gave birth to her husband's daughter Edigna and two more sons, Robert and Hugo. Robert died in childhood, while Edigna and Hugo became famous in their own ways. Hugo, or rather Count of Vermandois and Valois, called the Great, became one of the leaders of the first ever crusade, and later died liberating the Holy Land. And Edigna settled near Munich in a trunk of an old linden tree, and treated people and taught Christianity to the locals, for which Catholic Church canonized her in 17th century. By the way, on topic of the Catholic Church, let's touch on the issue of the religious affiliation of our French Queen. Those who insist that she didn't betray her native Orthodox faith, as well as those who accuse her of accepting Catholicism, forget to look at the dates. The fact is that the Great Schism, which divided the Church into Catholicism and Orthodox, occurred in the year 1054. And Anna went to France 3 years earlier, when the Church, despite all regional differences, was still one. Therefore, there was no need to convert to a new faith. There was only one faith, and all that remained was to adapt to local customs, to pray not in Church Slavonic, but in Latin, and also to cross yourself in other direction. But it's not that difficult. However, let's get back to the main plot. The illiterate king Henry I died 9 years after his marriage. Are scientists right that intellectual activity prolongs life? 7-year-old Philip I ascended the throne. Thus, Anna in Paris repeated the fate of her great-grandfather Sviatoslav and great-great-grandmother Olga, who after the death of Grand Prince Igor became the guardian of her son and de facto ruled the principality very successfully, which is worth talking about in a separate episode. But unlike Olga, Anna didn't take on the burden of state building. She accepted the appointed regent and limited her participation in state affairs to put in her signature next to her son's, in order to certify him. And also, she continued to sign herself in Cyrillic, Anna Reina, that is regent, Queen Anna. And here begins the melodramatic plot twist in the fate of our main character. 2 years after the death of her husband and king, she got married to the former main oppositionist, the harlot, and to top it all, the already married Raoul de Crépy, Count of Valois, nicknamed the Great. One can only guess how he got that nickname. But in order to marry the Dowager Queen, the Count had to get rid of his legitimate wife. How do you do it? It's simple. Accuse her of treason. Our Anna, in turn, had to leave home and abandon 3 children, 10-year-old King Philip on the throne, 7-year-old future Saint Edigna, and 5-year-old future Crusader Hugo. And they both just did it. Abandoning 3 kids? Are you sure that's a good role model? What if our female audience starts to mimic? But it's been done and dusted. Also, the people reacted just like you did. The hell broke loose. You just imagine. The offended countess complained to the Pope, who in response declared the marriage with Anna invalid and ordered the newlyweds to separate. They didn't. Raoul de Crépy clearly showed what he deemed of the papal opinion, after which the Pope accused him of bigamy and excommunicated him. In this situation, Anna showed a purely Ukrainian spirit. She also disregarded the Pope's opinion and stayed with the lover. It was then that her name completely disappeared from the French chronicles. Chroniclers didn't like those who challenged society and the church. The former queen returned to the chronicles only after the death of her second husband, in the year 1074. But by that time, her son Philip had already become a full-fledged king and didn't need his mother's care. Therefore, the queen withdrew from business, and further her trail is lost among other courtiers. Here, it would be nice to squeeze in a story about how in a year a strange novice appeared in a monastery near Kiev who spoke French and called her beloved Raoul during sleepless nights. But oh well, nothing like that happened. The opposite wasn't registered either. A nun in a French monastery who spoke Ukrainian and was remembering some Yaroslav at night, although both options are quite suitable for a series. However, the fact is that Anna Yaroslavna's grave hasn't been found. The year of her death is unknown, and the only trace left to her descendants is an autograph, or rather two, on the wall of Saint Sophia and in a French document. Nope, that plot's not gonna sell. How underwhelming. Agreed, so underwhelming. That one is definitely not a seller. How do Ukrainians know about Anna of Kiev? Considering all the information is in French documents, and even then, there is not much. And the cause of all this was Francophilia, the fancy for everything French, language, culture, history, which arose in the Russian Empire in the 18th century and peaked in the 19th. So, in 1800, Ukrainian Petro Dubrovsky, the secretary of the Russian diplomatic service in Paris, brought to St. Petersburg a collection of old prints, which he gained during the Great French Revolution. It's on par with stealing washing machines as war trophies. Stole it, brought it home, doesn't work since the water is out. That's right. No one paid attention to the collection, and then the sly Ukrainian announced that it was the part of Anna Yaroslavna's library, which she once took to Kiev. You will be surprised, but they believed him. The collection was taken to the Imperial Library, and Dubrovsky himself was assigned the librarian. That's how much books were treasured. Later, Napoleon's French army seized the Moscow and witnessed with their own eyes the distant and exotic, but in actuality the dirty and cold Muscovy. After the defeat of Napoleon, Russian troops appeared in Paris and carried out such an active cultural exchange that the French still call fast food joints bistro, from the Russian bistro, meaning fast. And Muscovites still consider it a bad omen to leave an empty bottle on the table. After all, the number of empty dishes on the table was used by waiters to calculate the payment in French bars and cafes 200 years ago. Russian officers, who by the way spoke French perfectly, hid the bottles under the table and that way avoided paying. Maybe that way they would bargain with their own consciousness. As in, it wasn't me, I was set up. Russian soldiers having consciousness? Unheard of. But all these happenings couldn't help but pique the interest of French elites for Muscovy. And that is why Russian culture has become fashionable among intellectuals. And that is why in 1821 the historical novel Agnès de France ou Le XIIe siècle was published in France, written by Amélie Julie Candille, a famous composer, librettist and writer. The author based her story on the chronicles of France and Byzantine, and judging by the chronological error in the title, because Anna lived in the 11th, not the 12th century, she became the first researcher of Anna's life. The novel was a success in France and was read by the elite in Russia. Riding the wave of fashion, the Russian Prince Alexander Lobanov-Rostovsky began to collect information about Anna herself. As a result, in the year 1825, he published a book in France, collection of historical documents about Queen Anna or Agnes, wife of King Henry I of France and daughter of Yaroslav, Grand Prince of Rus, with notes and remarks by Prince Alexander Lobanov-Rostovsky, adjutant of His Majesty, the Emperor of all Rus. Here we once again remind you, he published this book in France, in French, so it was first read by scientists, then by artists, after which scientific studies and literary works of French figures began to appear. And here the reverse effect has already begun to work. We hear information about Anna not from compatriots, whom we do not always trust, but directly from abroad, from France itself. This reinforces modern Ukrainian policy regarding the preservation of Anna's legacy abroad. The replacement of the inscription and the Rus on the monument in France with anti-Kiev, the monuments along her entire path to France, the scientific articles, all this shapes the opinion of the French. And if 200 years ago Moscow princes led this matter, now it's time for us, Ukrainians, especially since there is no shortage of our people in France. Therefore, dear friends, explain to the French and others, during the times of Anna of Kiev, frogs croaked where Moscow was to be, and Tsar Peter made up the name Russia only 700 years later, in 1721. Instead of making it up, he just borrowed the Greek name for our lands. Well, it's almost like if Morocco called itself German word Frankreich and appropriated the entire French heritage on that basis. Ukrainian artists also attached themselves to the halo of glory of the Kiev princess. Galician writer Ivan Filipchak wrote the novel Anna Yaroslavna, the Queen of France, back in 1933. Kiev author Valentin Sokolovsky published the book Anna, the Dialogy, or the White Queen. You may have heard that Anna Yaroslavna, or rather her legacy, which still thrives in France, once saved St. Sophia Cathedral from being destroyed by the communists. They were going to blow up the cathedral, just like they did with St. Michael's Golden Dome Monastery, but then French diplomats intervened. This fable was also invented by Kiev historian Viktor Kirkevich to, as they say, promote our compatriot in her homeland, because Ukrainians traditionally respect their own less than what's brought from abroad. It is what it is. We have such an inferiority complex. The fable about Anna and St. Sophia Cathedral dates back to the late 80s of the last century and seemingly achieved its goal, making Anna famous. The Soviet writer Antonin Ladinsky wrote a children's story by the same name as Filipchak's Anna Yaroslavna, the Queen of France, in the 1960s, and in the 70s it was made into a movie. But still, French artists pay more attention to our Queen. We found 5 books about her, 2 of which, Anne de Kiev, Histoire de Reine de France by Philippe Delorme, and Anne de Kiev, Reine de France by Regine de Forges, were translated into Ukrainian. So we believe the topic is relevant, attractive, and therefore we won't have to wait long for new works. And you and I have to remember, Ukraine is Europe, from the times of Anna, Yaroslav, Olga to the present day. Don't believe Soviet and imperial lies. Watch Ukrainian historical channels, learn about our past, and build the future. After all, the state is a joint effort. And cut. Thanks for watching.